I'll take this question. It says, and then you guys can chime in when I'm finished. It says, my 23-year-old daughter no longer believes in God and says the Bible is just stories and not real. How do I try to convince her or any young adult God is real? It's a great question. I think the first thing I would do if this was my daughter, I don't have a daughter, is just ask her what evidence she has to support that claim. Because often I think that we're dealing with arguments against Scripture, against Christianity that really don't have a basis. It's sort of this sort of common understanding that, oh, well, the Bible is just stories, but they don't really have any evidence to really support that position. And so I think it's really important just to ask a person, okay, great, what evidence do you have to really support that position? Because as someone who's studied Christianity, I studied it as an undergrad at Columbia, and I just got my master's over in Oxford. I'm really excited to say that there's a tremendous amount of evidence as far as the reliability of Scripture, what Tim was talking about. And the fact that it's not just stories is because, for example, the British Museum, the curator there was named Sir Geoffrey Kenyon. He was a curator there, the main curator for 25 years. He used the Old Testament to set up the museum because they found that the stories in Scripture were so accurate to history and archaeology that it was an entirely reliable source in the way that they would set up all the sort of things that they would set up in the museum. And so there's a lot of evidence that says, in fact, yes, there's stories in the sense that they're written down, but there's an incredible amount that they are accurate stories. So that's the Old Testament. And I think that in Scripture in large, I think there's a tremendous amount of evidence to support the dates, the figures that they're pointing to, those sort of questions as far as the stories aspect of this one. But how do you convince them that God is real? I think, for me, I think what's the best explanation for the universe that we see? I think as someone, I grew up in the ocean. I grew up surfing. I didn't grow up in the church. But I would sit in the ocean and I would look out on nature. And I was always, even as someone who didn't believe in a God, I was always sort of had this sort of thought that, my gosh, this universe is so complex. There's so much complexity in what I'm looking at here that what is the best explanation for the existence of this universe? And then we go from a scientific level, we look at something like DNA and we see information and rich amounts of information. And when we see information, obviously we think there's someone with an intellect every time we see information. And so it's just really saying, okay, what is the best explanation for the universe and where we find ourselves here? Is it chance? That's sort of these blind, unguided forces that brought this about? Or does it point to some sort of supreme intelligence behind this? And so that brought me to one point where I was, okay, there seems to be some sort of supreme intelligence, and that's a very reasonable and rational position to hold. And then kind of what Tim was talking about, the second and kind of the third point I would say is just that the diagnosis of our own heart. Now, I studied ethics, and so ethics deals with morals. How do we decide what's good and bad? What has value in life? All of these things are incredibly important to us as humans. We value them. We fight for justice because we believe there's such thing as justice. There's such thing as good. There's such thing as bad. There is evil in the world. The only way we're going to get that moral framework to begin to argue for these things in sort of objective good and bad is if there's some sort of objective moral reality that was created by a supreme intelligence. And so I think that by looking at those three things, it's a great way to start the conversation. That's kind of the track that I took.
Yeah, I would just add one thought to that is be okay with asking a question and then letting somebody sit in it for a while. I know that when we feel like we have answers, we want to ask a question, and if someone says, I don't know, we want to give an answer, but sometimes just ask a question, let somebody sit in. I think the question Will brought up is great. So if there is no creator behind this, there's no great intelligence, then what's this all about? And then just let somebody sit in that, and they may say, well, I don't know. Okay, maybe you should think about that. Those are those questions that kind of stir in the back of our hearts. Greg Koukl talks about putting a stone in somebody's shoe. Theologically, let's get them to have something that's kind of a little uncomfortable to the point where eventually they have to wrestle with that. So say, okay, if there is no great designer out there, what's this life all about? It's all just random chance? Well, I don't know. Okay, well, maybe that's something to think about. get people to start pondering, even if they don't give you an answer right then.